CSS1 came out in December of 1996. This is 3 years down the road. CSS2 came out in May of 1998. This is a year and a half down the road from that. And even in terms of CSS1 support, like I say, it was better, but still wasn't great. What got interesting, though, is that it was better enough that people wanted to do what it could do that older browsers couldn't, right? There was stuff that Netscape 4 just could not handle that IE5 could. And that's where the first CSS hack came from. And it looked like this. Link to a basic style sheet, and then import an advanced style sheet, because Netscape 4 didn't understand @import. Now, this looks more like a markup hack, but it's really a CSS hack, because you're using @import as a filter between advanced browsers and non-advanced browsers of the time. If only it had stopped there. And even that was, I mean, that was fairly, that could be fairly difficult to manage, because if you put enough stuff in your advanced style sheet, then the basic style sheet had so little styling to it that it was almost like you didn't need to bother. Now, at the time, there was a big argument as to whether or not you should do this, or you should use JavaScript, the browser snip, and then just hand over the style sheet based on which browser your browser detector came up with. And that was where we were, all first introduced to people who hacked their user agent string. So that instead of saying, Microsoft Internet Explorer, blah, 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 it would say, you don't need to know, get out of my cache file, or whatever. I've seen these things in my in my own server logs. I'm sure you have too. People leaving little jokes for people who read their web server access logs. And also there was the forward-looking argument of, well, you never know what a future browser will do, and Internet Explorer, or well, no one said this to Internet Explorer because it was from Microsoft. The next version of Netscape could be perfect with CSS, and then you'd be handing over the wrong style sheet, and et cetera, et cetera. In the midst of all this, actual salvation, as it were. Internet Explorer for the Mac. Now, 5.0 for the Mac is really the one that I want to have up here, but I couldn't find the splash screen for 5.0. So I grabbed this one. When IE5 for the Mac came out, it was really nothing short of revolutionary in a lot of ways, but in the CSS realm in particular. Here are the things that it added, just some of the things that it added. Doc type switching. There wouldn't probably be doc type switching today if not for two people, Todd Farner and Tantek Celik. Todd Farner, in this same time frame, said either on Usenet or a mailing list, I haven't been able to track down the original reference, we have this problem here, right? We have these browsers that are doing stuff wrong. Todd Farner, by the way, anyone recognize that name? Todd Farner? Yeah, okay. At least some recognition. He's making bikes now, so they're Clever Chimp bikes. If you're a biker, you might have actually heard of those. Anyway, he was a designer. He worked with David Siegel actually in the same agency, and he was in the CSS at the beginning, and wrote a lot of really stunningly intelligent things about font sizing and all the same stuff that we're worrying about today. Some of the most cogent observations about that were made by Todd back in the late 90s. But he had looked at the browser landscape and said, okay, we have these old browsers that are doing wrong stuff. Internet Explorer for Windows has the box model wrong, right? And font sizing is messed up because Internet Explorer thinks that the default is small, and Netscape thinks the default is medium, which is what the specification says. But if you start to dig into it, what Internet Explorer does actually makes some sense. Anyway. And browsers are stuck on this path, right? What we need is we need some kind of out. We need a toggle where authors could say, no, really, do it the standards way instead of the old way. And wouldn't that be cool if they could just do it in the document? And hey, maybe the doc type would work, because the doc type theoretically should be part of documents, but it never is. So maybe if authors said that they're really using HTML 4.0 strict, then that would be used as sort of a switch to go into standards mode. Todd thinking out loud. So Tontech did it in IE for the Mac, IE 5 for the Mac. There was also a display resolution setting. If you dug far enough into the preferences, there's actually a dialog that says, go get a, basically says, go get a ruler. Here's a ruler on the screen. Hold the ruler up to this ruler and then drag it back and forth until 1 inch equals 1 inch. And then it would know exactly how many pixels per inch you had on your monitor to several decimal places in point of fact. And so that way, if you used points for font sizing, for example, they would show up as actual points. If you held up a typographic ruler, they would be however many points tall you said they should be. 12 points would, in fact, be 12 points. Introduced text zoom. There had been resize, text resize buttons in earlier versions of Internet Explorer, but text zoom was the first one that really let you zoom the text no matter what, even if the author had set their text size to 60. Its CSS1 support was excellent, not perfect. There still hasn't been a perfect CSS1 implementation, but it was quite excellent. Even today, it holds up fairly well. There are a few things that are a little weird, but it holds up quite well even today. The CSS2 support was, I feel comfortable saying decent. I wouldn't say great, especially in positioning where it has a number of bugs, many of which I had to deal with as recently as last year. But the things that it tried, it did well. Selectors, for example, it has very good CSS2 selector support. And of course, full PNG support, like alpha channels in PNGs. It supported when it was released in 2000. And a whole bunch of other stuff, page placeholders, and just the list goes on for quite a while. But sort of in the CSS and web design space, these are the big ones. The only reason that IE6 for Windows has doc type switching is this right here, and the fact that the two teams actually did talk to each other. Tontech was able to work with the Windows team and say, okay, no, this is how you do it. Let's have these be consistent. Unfortunately, he couldn't get them to implement TextZoom, although he did try. A lot of the sloppy parser bugs in IE6, or I'm sorry, IE5 and IE 5.5, things like allowing a space between a value and its unit, being allowed to leave off the octothorpe in front of a hexadecimal color value, getting the default font size wrong, all that stuff got taken out because of basically what happened here. And one of the things that the doc type switch also helped with was the width problem, the box model problem. Because in IE5 and IE5.5, width was defined to be this distance. Well, the CSS specification says it's really only here to here. And IE6 in standards mode does the right thing. IE6 in quirks mode, the thing that earlier versions of Internet Explorer did. That being a perfect illustration of why Todd was right, we needed that switch. Whatever that switch was, he proposed doc type because he's a really smart guy and sort of understood that would probably be the way to do it. But even if it had been some kind of meta element, whatever the switch was, it needed to be there. And so, and this is why, because otherwise, just imagine if IE6 had upgraded and done the correct width, and then every page that had ever been developed under IE5 and IE5.5 just broke, basically, in terms of layout, just went completely crazy. So, what's interesting, though, is that before IE6 came out, there needed to be a way. There were just enough browsers at that point. There was IE5 for the Mac. Netscape 6 was coming out. Opera had made very solid gains at that point in CSS support. And there needed to be some other kind of switch, because everyone using Internet Explorer, and there were a few people doing that, was using IE5 and IE55. And they had the CSS box model wrong. They had width incorrectly set. There needed to be a way to say, okay, Internet Explorer for Windows gets these values for width, and browsers actually know what they're doing, get these values for width. That became the box model hack, which was devised by Contek Celik, as a matter of fact, who, writing on his site, said, hey, here's how we can do this. This is just an example. These are example values, but we have a div, and we want the actual content to be 300 pixels wide, but we want the overall box to be 400 pixels wide. So what we'll do is we'll exploit a parsing bug in Internet Explorer that says, okay, width 400 pixels, and then basically IE for Windows hits this and stops. It says, oh, the rule's done when it hits this point. It ignores this part. But browsers that don't have this parsing bug keep going, find the 300 pixels, which overrides the 400 pixels, and off they go. The only problem was Opera got the box model right, but had the same parsing bug, because Opera has had a very interesting history in being very standards compliant, but also doing a really good job of emulating Internet Explorer for Windows parsing engine. I don't know how they've spent so much time reverse engineering that parsing engine, and I'm still not sure why, but anyway. So then Contech had to devise basically the child selector hack to say, well, Opera's going to see this value, or Opera's not going to see this value, it's going to see this value and get it wrong, so we need a be nice to Opera rule, which is exactly what he called it. So HTML child body, blah, 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 with 300 pixels, Opera can see that. Internet Explorer for Windows still won't see that because it doesn't understand child selectors, and there you go. Now, to me, this probably should have been called the voice family hack, because this is really where the hack is. It's, taking advantage of parsing bug as applied to the voice family value. But because what Contech was trying to do was give people a way to handle box model problems, that's why it ended up being called the box model hack. That pretty much lit the fuse for CSS hack. This is a partial list of CSS hacks from the CSS Discussed wiki. I took the screenshot a few days ago, as a matter of fact. And hacks include, this is just some of them. And then here's a full section just for Mac browsers. The CodeBitch OmniWeb hack. Hides files from OmniWeb. This is one of those things that you look at and you say to yourself, man, only that had never been necessary. But it was, of course. Because without these hacks, it would have been JavaScript browser sniffing. Uh-oh. Is that for me? There's either JavaScript browser sniffing and serving up different style sheets, or there's not really doing much styling at all. And I'm sure there would have been a number of people who would have been glad to not do any styling at all, except they couldn't really do otherwise. So, hacks galore. Let's see, the import hack variation table. There's a whole table of variants on that import hack that I showed you originally, the link import hack. Someone has a whole table just of variations on that. Using media queries, and so on. Contech ended up devising a few of them. There was a bandpass filter and a midpass filter, which exploited other parsing bugs in order to do other fun stuff. But anyway, Contech has since had time to regret that in a posting last year on his website, or maybe it was earlier this year. He talked about opening a Pandora's box. His hack actually had a distinguishing characteristic that many hacks didn't. His hack was valid CSS. You might not believe that. But if you look at it, it doesn't look like it's valid, but it actually does validate. Because this is referring to a voice family whose file name is quote, escape quote, angle bracket quote. And so this hack will work fine